In the most divisive of times, the great debates rage on. Who was the best Batman? Was the book truly better than the movie? Did Han shoot first? Nerds with Opinions will seek to answer life's greatest questions. Hello, fellow nerds. You are listening to Nerds with Opinions, episode number 1. Yes, you heard that correctly. Number 1, the very first one. The first of many, I hope. I'm really excited. My name's Matt Holman. I'm your host. Before we really dive into this thing, though, and we get into my guest for today, I want to basically intro what this podcast is going to be about, what kind of ride we're going to go on together. And like I said, in hopefully many more episodes. So basically when I came up with Nerds with Opinions, I thought about all the different types of fandom and pop culture that I'm into, and the kind of conversations I have with my friends about said fandoms, about said pop culture. And a lot of times it can equate to very spirited, opinionated, and passionate conversations. The kind of conversations you have right after the newest episode of Game of Thrones, right when you're walking out of the theater, when you just saw the newest Avengers and your mind has just been completely blown. Those sorts of conversations. That's the kind of stuff we're going to be talking about on Nerds with Opinions. We're going to be covering, like I said, all sorts of pop culture and fandom. We're going to be talking movies. We're going to be talking television. We're going to be talking music. Maybe professional wrestling. I'm kind of a professional wrestling nerd. Maybe toy collecting. I collect toys. Anything and everything will be covered. Nothing's off limits. I'm basically going to be sitting down as much as I can with people that I know that are super passionate about different sorts of things and super knowledgeable. And we're just going to just hash stuff out and discuss things. Which leads me into my first guest. Today I'm going to be sitting down with my good buddy, Jimmy Leavens, and we're going to be discussing nostalgia. Nostalgia in pop culture and in fandom and in media. We're going to be talking about when does it work? When is it a good thing? When is it a bad thing? When is it a crutch or it's too kitschy? We're going to be talking about specific examples of nostalgia in media. Guaranteed we're going to be talking about Stranger Things for you Stranger Things fans, because that's probably the shining example of using nostalgia in a new narrative. We're going to be covering all that and a little bit more today on Nerds with Opinions. All right, so I'm sitting here with my good buddy, Jimmy Leavens, my first guest on Nerds with Opinions. How you doing today, man?
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm doing swell. I mean, first guest, it's a lot of pressure.
Dude, I have full confidence and faith in you. I think that I'm stoked that actually this worked out, that you're the first person, because you're actually one of the first people that I thought of to do this.
Oh, really? Nice.
Yeah. I would, just to kind of intro Jimmy, he and I met at college here at SOU, and I would call you a film and media connoisseur. Is that fair?
Definitely. I mean, I'm not scholarly, but I like to think that I can speak pop culture and movie references pretty well.
Right. Well, I would say a connoisseur is somebody that, maybe they're not
I can be picky,
an expert, but they know what tastes good, right?
Oh, yes. I know what I like.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So, like I said today in the intro, we are talking about nostalgia. And actually, this was an idea of yours. We were discussing things that we could talk about, and you suggested this, and I loved it. I was instantly into it. And the first thing I want to ask you is, why nostalgia? Why did that pop in your head?
Well, I mean, like, we're all millennials. I mean, like, basically our childhood is saturated with all these media, pop culture, internet, you name it. And right now it's trending. I mean, everything that we kind of grew up in the 90s is coming back. Everything our previous generations grown up with is coming back. Especially nowadays, everything is 80s right now, or at least kind of 80s, 90s, especially with stuff like Stranger Things, all these adaptations of comics. Stuff that I grew up on is now coming back into the public domain, like not public domain, but like public interest. Right. And new generations are coming into it. And of course, it's weird to say this since we're so young, but it makes you feel old, kind of, doesn't it?
A little bit. So actually, that's a good question. So how old are you?
I'm 24.
Okay, so you were born...
93.
93. Okay, so yeah. So you really were definitely digging deep into the 90s stuff. I'm a few years older than you, but I was like tail end of the 80s. Mm-hmm. So I caught the tail end of that and then all of the 90s. So before we kind of really dive deep into the I suppose, philosophy and nature of nostalgia, let's just keep it nice and digestible. Mm-hmm. And so that generation, what are some of like those really nostalgic franchises for you?
Well, it's like, I mean, like talking about iconic, I mean, even before I saw them, everyone always saw things like, at least growing up, I would always see these references to stuff like Star Wars, Indiana Jones of the 80s. And then, of course, 90s, you got Pokemon and whatnot. And all these things are just so saturated that even if you don't know the reference or seen the films, you at least understand that's where it's from. That's how...
Right.
So I definitely would say those would definitely be the most iconic in terms of the 80s, if we're talking about that specifically, is Star Wars, Indiana Jones. I mean, Star Wars is technically 70s, but it overlaps. You have Star Trek, you got like... and you have like 80s sci-fi horror movies. You got... like nowadays, I mean, Stranger Things is basically quoting every single 80s pop culture text known to man. It's insane.
So that's a good segue into another question I want to ask you is, where do you think nostalgia comes from on a personal level for just kind of a generalized,
Well, of course, question. I mean, when I think of nostalgia, it's definitely kind of you want to recollect, you want to remember something. It's that feeling of, I miss that or I remember that. And a lot of times people, I mean, there's, of course, the whole you wish things were the way they were back in the day versus, it's hard to really say. I mean, it's right now, everyone's so focused on nostalgia, at least in my opinion, is because they kind of want something to escape to. They want to escape to a time that's familiar to them. Especially with, of course, I mean, I don't need to tell you about stuff's going on in pop culture and the media and the world right now. And we want something familiar and comfortable to kind of fall back to. And in a way, that's fine, but it can get to the point where it can be a little dangerous, especially if you're dwelling too much on stuff in the past. Yet, on the other hand, we do focus on things in the past to understand what's going on in the present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've wondered this myself because I find... even myself very often diving into that escapism because kind of, jumping off of what you were mentioning with the kind of socio-political ramifications of nostalgia. We'll get further into that because I definitely want to talk more about that. But I think because of a lot of the negative stuff that we consume in social media and in the
opening release, and it's almost like now films nowadays just focus on that so much to where, I mean, honestly, let's be real. Nothing's new under the sun. So I don't think we need to get into the whole, oh, this is original, this is just a modification, of course, what happened in this older movie from the 80s and whatnot. And,
right.
But no, I mean, it's just like that in itself, like nostalgia in pop culture is, in my opinion, it's a visual language.
So you were speaking about that as a form of communication. Now, do you think that pop culture referencing, nostalgia, do you think that is an evolved form of communication, or perhaps is this a devolved form of communication because we're in about like a soundbite culture? You know, we're in a tweeting culture of 48 characters or less. All right, it's probably more than that. I think that's incorrect.
Yeah,
but you know what I mean. Like,
attention span definitely falls into play. Especially with our generation. I mean, we're kind of like given a lot of crap for, of course, having short attention spans and focusing solely on the visual.
Right.
But like, I don't know. It's like when you were kind of referring to the whole, is nostalgia evolving? And I think, I mean, in the end, pop culture always evolves because in the end, there's always something new being added into culture. So it's always evolving. Things are always being reevaluated. Things are always being revisited and kind of reinterpreted. So there's this recycling of old and new text that's being merged, remixed, and whatnot. I've done many papers dealing with stuff like that in terms of pastiche culture and remix culture. Whether or not we want to talk about Tarantino films or you want to talk about like Star Wars itself. I mean, even before referencing films, before that, films referenced things like myths and legends and folklore and literature. Even before that, those texts would then themselves be referenced to spoken word and classic Greek theater, and then just going
Star Wars
back.
is the hero's journey.
Exactly, everything's the freaking hero's journey. Yeah, I mean, it's just like literally. I mean, it's almost like people have credits. Films have credits. It would almost be interesting to see the references, like like a works cited paper of what did this director refer to during this movie? Because that's my biggest kick, is watching a movie and feeling like this person referenced this.
That might be a thing of not wanting to see how the sausage is made.
I know,
because I think it might ruin the magic.
No one wants to admit that they're unoriginal, but in the end, I mean, like, nothing is original nowadays.
Well, some not necessarily though, because some artists seem to wear this as a badge of honor. We talked about Stranger Things, and we'll definitely get further into Stranger Things, but Duffer Brothers. Oh yeah, those dudes, they don't give a shit if people.
They do not give a shit.
If people, think that their stuff is ultimately derivative, and I mean, regardless of your opinion of them, I mean that's admirable that they believe in their art so much, and they wear the references and the influences on like a badge of honor.
Oh yeah, they're definitely like fanboy directors. I personally love them for that as well. Don't get me wrong. Like, I think because they embrace it and they understand the text so well to what they're referencing, they can in itself almost kind of know how to use it. I mean, when I'm watching Stranger Things, of course they're making references to stuff I know, but instead of kind of relying on that reference that only a few people get to as a crutch, they kind of make it a huge part of the characters, a huge part of the background, the worlds the characters are in, to where almost nostalgia in Stranger Things is that in itself as a character. Like, I mean, of course, like when you'll see posters in the background of their room, you'll see characters refer to D&D, you see like props and toys and little things on their shelves, you'll see them play video games in the arcade and stuff that, of course, we reference, but Stranger Things, even though it's in that genre of like fantasy, horror, sci-fi, coming of age, it's literally, if 80s were a genre, it is 80s.
Right. And I think that decades can absolutely be at least a subgenre. And
definitely.
I mean, 80s is like probably the finest example of that.
Yeah, 80s is definitely, I would say, the most like loudest and colorful. I mean, there's the 70s, of course, but definitely it's iconic. I mean, when you look at something that's from the 80s, it's from the 80s. I mean, like, it's just the style itself is so recognizable.
Well, really, and I think there could be a lot to say about that in terms of nostalgia, because really 80s was probably the last heyday of analog. I mean, really, because even though, of course, our generation, if the majority of your childhood was over the course of the 90s, you probably consumed some analog. I mean, I know I did. But really the 80s was like that last decade where, I mean, almost every medium was analog to some sort. And the whole digital thing didn't really take off until the latter part of the 90s. So I think that's another reason, that the 80s is so fondly remembered, because another thing I've noticed with nostalgia, and the current state of nostalgia, at least with our generation, is there is also that desire for analog, vinyl records. I see some people get into VHS. I don't get that.
Yeah, the wanting for the physical almost.
Right, yeah. I think it's something tangible, something you can hold on to.
It's always interesting when, of course, like I said, I was born in 93, before the 80s. The 80s was something I just saw in like just almost like artifacts.
Well, I call that post-80s, though.
Yeah. And it's almost like, it's interesting when, of course, millennials, or at least any new generation, is kind of having nostalgia for a time they didn't really grow up in. It's almost kind of like what you said. They kind of, they're it's like that curiosity. They're like, man, what was that like? And so they're kind of almost living through it by seeing this new media like Stranger Things, or at least kind of going to vintage stores and buying VHSs, which, of course, I don't get the appeal either. I mean, like, once the reel's damaged.
Let's be honest, people. It looks terrible.
I know. Keep it for your collection all you want, but get something better quality.
Yeah, Blu-ray, people.
I know the charm of having to rewind it with a screwdriver. Back in the day, if you don't have a VHS rewinder, which I still have, of course.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. But no, I mean, like, I'm that way too. I love the physical. I like working with my hands. I love the texture, just the feel. I mean, of course, when you have it in your hands, you know it's there. You know you don't worry about getting deleted or having to back it up on the cloud.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I still keep my old VHSs. I still keep my old comic books. It's not all on web at the moment. It's kind of, I like having that visual collection of references in my bedroom. It's sort of like, if you were to enter my room or my bookshelf, you would basically get, this is what Jimmy's into. And I think that's...
Well, I think it's a snapshot of your life, too.
Definitely, too. Like, into the mind, almost.
Yeah. So, moving forward here, I mean, we kind of basically touched a bit on this, but I'd like to dive a little deeper on what you feel like the current landscape of pop culture and in media, why that is so nostalgia-driven. We kind of touched on, like, maybe the socio-political ramifications of that. But I'd like to dive a little deeper into that specifically. Why you think that, why we're there? Why is it so nostalgia-driven?
Well, I think right now, it's kind of like what I said earlier, it's people want something to kind of go into, the escapism, but also, of course, nostalgia is trending. I mean, nostalgia definitely has an audience. Nostalgia is profitable. I mean, like, of course, people want to see things they get the references to. And, of course, with, say, franchises, I mean, literally, like, nowadays, all these franchises are kind of in this cycle of they want to build anticipation so they can profit off it when the film is released, regardless if it's good or not. But they know people want to see that because they're so caught up in it, they're so invested in it. And definitely, it's interesting because, like I said earlier, everything is 80s interest, or at least stuff that came from the 80s but in contemporary setting. It was the same back in the 80s or the 70s, back when people longed for the 50s, or back in the industrial area, people longed for the, medieval times. It's always changing. Like, who knows, in the 2030s, people want to revisit the 2000s, which 2000s were weird in my opinion. They weren't really that memorable to me personally, other than the Backstreet Boys and whatnot. Definitely I would say, like, nostalgia is so saturated right now because it may sound a little negative, but it's profitable, and I think that's one of the big reasons why people are so focused on that.
Well, let's talk about that, because I've got that as one of the bullet points that I want to talk about. It's big business.
Oh, yeah.
And we live in a capitalist culture.
Yeah.
And there's nostalgia, especially, just not only the actual media that's being put out, but the licensing.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a huge Star Wars fan, but the licensing is rather gratuitous and, extremely over the top. I mean, even Stranger Things, like, they've really dove into the licensing. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the monetization of nostalgic art and, being in this capitalist culture. I can't necessarily speak to outside of Western society. But I wonder if nostalgia is as much of a thing in a society that's not a capitalist-driven society. Because I feel like that, and I'm not trying to lead your answer, but I kind of wonder if maybe some of the nostalgia, our reaction to it anyways, is we're being fed a little bait.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I mean, of course, when you have this recycling of media, and of course, like the fact that things are evolving, we have new things this pop culture reference could take the form of. I mean, video games, now VR. Who knows, we'll have probably VR episodes of classic TV back in the day. But you'll still have to buy that.
I'm sure it will happen.
Oh, yeah, it will happen. I look forward to buying it. See, there's the bait. It's that, and there's kind of that weird irony where it's like, oh, man, I know I'm going to hate this. I know it's not going to be very good, but I still see it anyway because I've been so invested in it. It's sort of like we admit that it's bait. We kind of admit that we're kind of being pulled into it. It's sort of like we embrace it.
Well, dude, that's why that's why the Member Berries episode of South Park, have you seen that?
Member Berries? I don't think so. Is it newer?
So, yeah, I think it's like within the last couple seasons, but they're basically making fun of when Star Wars was rebooted and they were doing The Force Awakens, and they were kind of chopping at J.J. Abrams. Basically, like
this is new. No, it's still
not
the same thing.
Yeah, and it's not. They were kind of suggesting. I tend to disagree, but they were saying basically it's not a very good movie. All it is just scratching your nostalgia itches.
Yeah,
and of course, in true South Park fashion, it was all dictated by member berries, which are little berries, and then they give you little suggestions like. They have these funny little voices like, remember Han Solo? You got to check it out. For the people listening to this, if you haven't seen that was a terrible description, but you should definitely check it out. It speaks to what we're talking about.
I'm definitely going to check that out now because I'm definitely interested in what's going on in this nostalgia-obsessed culture right now. It can only mean that like something's going down in our own culture that we're just kind of ignoring.
Right. Well, I think South Park definitely has their fingers on the pulse.
As they usually do.
So, talking about all, nostalgia and everything, I want to know what you think are examples of when nostalgia is working. When is it used in a fashion that you feel like is a truly organic, maybe not necessarily, more artistic, maybe not necessarily monetization first and foremost, fashion?
It's hard to say because, of course, it depends on who you ask. As someone that's seen lots of current film, contemporary and classic, I would say, for me at least, the one who knows how to utilize pastiche nostalgia and the idea of just referencing over and over again, but remixing, reevaluating what it is, and reinterpreting their own fashion is, I would say, someone that at least knows the material to a T. Someone that basically speaks the language, if you will. Whether it's like, say, Tarantino, who basically is like the human film encyclopedia at the moment, or in this case, like J.J. Abrams, at least, even though he's not my favorite director, he's someone that at least knows Star Wars, at least. He's a fanboy.
Right.
And he also knows how to basically bring that interest of Star Wars back into people by making it familiar and prolonging a new hope. So someone definitely... I think nostalgia in film, or at least when someone utilizes it in the good fashion, is when they understand the material and they're not trying to pander to that audience by being like, yeah, I can understand this.
And it doesn't become bastardized.
Yeah. They know how to speak to the fan and to the audience member.
Right. So you feel like as long as they are speaking that language correctly, it's not patronizing?
Well, it's also kind of like, it can be patronizing. Another factor of what makes someone utilizing nostalgia successfully and what media they use is also not only understanding what the material is, what the audience likes, but also how to reinterpret it in a new fashion to the current climate and culture that's going on. Like, for instance, of course, kind of like with Star Wars and Stranger Things, people are bringing back what we're familiar with, but understanding, okay, this is what our current society is like. How can let's reinterpret it now, to basically make people question what that period of time was and what that medium was. It's sort of dissecting in a way, like someone that knows the material but also wants to dissect at the same time. They're willing to criticize their love.
Now, I totally agree with you, and I think that one thing that I've noticed, I think Stranger Things is a good example. Star Wars is a good example. There's plenty of good examples out there, but numerous. I think when nostalgia is used well, is used as that bait, but not in a patronizing way or necessarily trying to force feed, fandom or anything like that, but just enough to like, here's a tasty tidbit, here's some familiarity, come on in. And then as the narrative progresses, that's when the nice original storytelling begins. And I feel like the Duffer Brothers are doing that really, really well. Obviously, it's still an Easter egg laden show, but I noticed in the second season that there's far more, I feel like, original storytelling, far more original shots, less direct references.
Like copy, paste, repeat.
Right. And I think the same thing with The Last Jedi. I have my feelings on that, and we could have a whole nother podcast just on Star Wars.
Oh, don't get me started.
But I think, this is just my opinion, but if there was any sort of criticism on, like Force Awakens is just like A New Hope, you absolutely can't say that The Last Jedi was just like Empire. And I think that Disney, love them or hate them, use The Force Awakens as that first step to like, okay, let's get everybody reinvested after the mixed results of the prequels, and then let's get into this original story.
Oh yeah,
in that regard, I think that they're executing that flawlessly. And
it's almost kind of like they're eager to explore, which is interesting. Eager to explore where the previous like showrunners or creators didn't really go in the direction of. It's I think it's just that the interest to just see where it could go. And I kind of like what you were saying, just inviting the audience in and then just like, here's something you've never expected before in this realm of fandom.
Well, I appreciate that because it's ultimately not necessarily playing it safe.
Exactly.
And that's when things, I think, get really complacent. With any film series or television series or what have you. I think that it's definitely where franchises go to die. Yeah, is when you start doing lazy writing that's easy.
It's almost like I like to use this word original all the time, but definitely new ways to reevaluate things come from almost having a structure to work around. It's sort of like, for me creatively, I like to call it working in a box, where I could open the box if I want to, I could leave it if I want to, I can stay inside if I want to, but I at least have something to work around. And it's sort of like, in the end, 100% freedom, no one ever wants. So I kind of agreeing with you on Stranger Things is they have this framework of 80s pop culture, but they're definitely kind of being like, we'll work within this realm, but we're going to do some new stuff going down. Like, that's definitely kind of how original things are made, end quote, is when they kind of have something to work with, basically. Those are the tools that they're using, and they're just making something new using those tools that we're familiar with.
So what about, because I want to definitely ask you about examples of nostalgia that you feel like are poor, but before we go there, we've talked a lot about like Stranger Things and Star Wars, where the nostalgia is very thick and palpable. But what about, I was thinking about franchises where there's just a sliver, just enough that you can feel it and you go, oh, this is kind of reminds me of this, but it is really its own thing. Like specifically, the first thing that popped into my head was Black Mirror. To me, feels very much like a really fucked up version of the Twilight Zone. Oh, and yes. I grew up in the Twilight Zone. My dad was into it, and so there's enough of that, like, oh, that kind of reminds me of this. That, but it's its own thing. I'm not saying it's anything like the Twilight Zone.
I actually haven't seen Black Mirror. This is the kicker. I'm behind.
Then I will say no more. But I think, okay, so that aside, that would be my opinion on something. But can you think of anything like that where they're just using just a tiny shred of nostalgia, where somebody's going to sit down and go, oh, that feels like this, or that kind of reminds me of this, and then it's its own thing.
Oh yeah, it's at that kind of like what you said about Black Mirror versus Twilight Zone. They both kind of use that interest of anthology storytelling,
right?
And of course, that can go back to Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes series. Where literally you kind of had like this weekly serial, and even after that, you had like the TV serials where a new episode every week, and so
radio before that.
Oh yeah, even that. Yeah, so it's kind of like that. It's almost like that kind of that interest in it. That's almost kind of like nostalgia for a genre, or at least a method or kind of a vehicle of telling stories, where you kind of have like, okay, we have this one little bit done, onto the next little story. Okay, done with that, on to the next story. Where you kind of have you sort of have like this gigantic world to work around with all these things going around in it, or at least this theme. In this case, Black Mirror, I'm not seeing it, but at least I understand that the theme in Black Mirror is downside to technology, the dark side of technology. Black Mirror being, of course, the Black Mirror on your phone and screens.
Sure.
Yeah. I only caught that recently, so I'm definitely, it's almost, I'm afraid to watch it because I know how much of a downer it's going to make me feel. It's going to be so good.
Dude,
I'm going to be so depressed.
It makes you hate humanity and want to rebel against your technology. But then then you also, like, it's one of those things that you just accept that you're like, oh man, this is all so true. And it's bleak though.
You just embrace the bleakness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On that same note, I'm pretty sure we've discussed this in the past, but I think this is another example of this, and I would love to, get a counter argument if you disagree. What about Blade Runner 2049? I feel like that's a perfect example of a little bit of nostalgia because Harrison Ford's in it, but that was its own thing.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it's like in the trailer itself, they kind of did that little bit of taste. Where at the end, you saw Harrison Ford, and you're like, okay, this is what we're familiar with.
Right.
This is the classic part. But then itself, I mean, it still has that same kind of tone in a way. But like you said, it's its own thing. I mean, like the only like if it wasn't called Blade Runner 2049, it could have been called something else entirely. It's just kind of it's another story in that world.
Well, yeah, I think that they did an amazing job with, like you said, making another story in that world. But I wasn't sitting there going, okay, this is basically just a modern update of the original Blade Runner, which that's a nearly flawless film. That it needed to be its own thing.
Oh yeah, it has to be. Yeah.
So I think that's another good example of that. So now I gotta hear what you feel like
it's a crutch.
Yeah, or stuff that's kitschy.
Because I don't know. I think how to define kitschy. I mean, basically, when I think of the word kitschy, it's almost like it basically means like pandering in a way, right? Or
the stuff that I like that you feel like is a cheaply used
cheap copy,
nostalgia.
Well, it's kind of thing because like a lot of things I thought were that way, but then I kind of reevaluated it later down the road. It became not be. So it's one of those subjective things. Like,
sure,
I would almost say like, and this may be something that I might get a lot of heat for, but
oh no, I
think a lot of people think that a lot of the current Marvel films are that way. I don't think so personally, but it's sort of like I have to take my stance out of what I think and thinking how would this other person see it, and it's sort of that whole like I think a bad example of using nostalgia in a film is one that of course it's almost like it overly relies on it to the point where it can't exist without the other. But that in itself is what a franchise is. You can't really watch, like, of course, Infinity War without seeing the prior films. It will basically be a mess that will make no sense whatsoever if you don't know them.
Yeah.
So I would definitely say that would be a bad example. That's kind of why made Black Panther a really strong Marvel film, is it didn't really rely on you knowing who Captain America was. It didn't rely on you knowing, okay, this is what happened in Avengers 1 or Age of Ultron. It was his own thing about this one character. So I think... So I would definitely say an example of a bad use of nostalgia is where it expects everyone to know what's going on. to the point where it really can't exist without the material. It's almost like it can't be its own thing. Because I've met a lot of media where I get the reference, but someone else doesn't, but they still enjoy it. I think that's a strong example of good nostalgia, is being able to at least tell the story without everyone in the freaking world knowing what the reference is. But a bad example is someone that you almost kind of, I think you over-expect your audience to know everything.
So would you liken it to maybe like gourmet cooking, where the layman could enjoy this dish just as much as anybody else, but the person with the more trained palate can go, oh, okay, or wine. You know, I know that's what you do for a living, is pour wine.
Yeah.
You know, where like a trained, consumer of wine can pick up those sorts of notes, but it's good enough wine that anybody can enjoy it.
That's definitely a good allegory. I definitely would say it's a strong trait of a director or storyteller, is one that knows how to speak to many different people. Almost like as if it's kind of bringing back to the point of pop culture being a language, is being able to speak, almost being bilingual in a way, where I can speak to the common person who doesn't know this medium, but I want to introduce him to it. I mean, what do you think is a bad example of a film that uses a crutch? Because I think once I hear yours, I'll definitely have more examples to come forward.
Well, I think that, I think on the opposite coin of Marvel, of course, is the inevitable DCEU conversation.
DCEU.
And I would say that as much as I've been a huge fan of a lot of those films, and I think that they get a bad rap. But Justice League, I think there you have an example of, I think, too much nostalgia. The basic, mixed reaction to Batman versus Superman of, oh, well, this is an extremely dark take on Batman, basically led all the producers of those films to take Justice League and go, okay, let's give them the more shiny, morally sound, easily digestible, what people know version of Batman. And where I think that Ben Affleck, who's a pretty mixed bag as far as an actor goes, I think that he was the strongest portion of Batman vs. Superman, in my opinion. And then he turned into one of the weakest parts. That was an interesting film because I think that there was just kind of stuff thrown at the wall.
It's almost like they're trying to follow the formula to a T. We're like, okay, we got to meet this point, this point, this point, this point. Because I think what makes DCEU, at least in my opinion, like weaker of the two is the fact that they're trying so hard to be like Marvel. But in the end, if DCEU came first, Marvel would follow suit in a weird way. I mean, like, do you think that's the case?
I think that this is a totally different thing off of nostalgia, but I think to answer your question, I think DC has a bit of an identity crisis because they are trying to follow Marvel, and then probably what they should have done from the get-go was just kind of continue on their own path.
Be their own thing, definitely.
Yeah, and maybe those films would have never been as successful as the Marvel films, but I don't think they would have been as as negatively received. But the nostalgia question, though, I think, like, specifically when I was watching that film, there was some elements that were really good that I was surprised with. I thought that the characterization of the Cyborg character was surprisingly good, but not as familiar of a character. So I think that the ones that were familiar, there was just a grossly over nostalgic sheen on it.
It's like 100% nostalgic references instead of just having a good narrative with references woven through it.
Well, yeah, and I think that they were taking it back to kind of more of like Golden Age of Comics era Batman and Superman. I mean, that first opening shot, that was the Joss Whedon reshots of the, where they VFX'd out Henry Cavill's mustache. Oh, good Lord.
It's cringe.
Anyways, he's his hands are on his hips, his chest is puffed out, and I was like, okay, and I actually am a fan of him in that role, but the writing was overly nostalgic in a gross and lazy way, because rather than doing something edgy of like, okay, this Superman's a little darker take than what you're used to, he broke Zod's neck in the end of Man of Steel. That's what I want to see, because
spoiler alert.
It's... Oh, come on.
I've seen it.
That's been out forever. Folks, if you haven't seen that, you deserved that.
Yeah.
But that's what, I want to see, because we've seen the schoolboy version, perfectly done in the 70s by Christopher Reeves. And the not so great follow-up with Brandon Routh, and I think that a different take and not necessarily an overly nostalgic one was good. So that's a long answer to your question.
I know. Well, sort of like, not kind of hearing your opinion, I definitely thought of another example of like what I think at least is I still like it enough, but it's one that I have not as revisited as much as the original trilogy. And that would be, I would say, I like it to an extent, I think the Hobbit trilogy.
Oh, dude. Okay, yeah.
That's its own topic. That's its own topic. But
yeah, you're absolutely right.
The short nutshell, this is my biggest fault with the Hobbit. The fact that we kind of touched base on this. It's not trying to be its own thing. It's trying to copy the prior nostalgia that you're familiar with. Lord of the Rings, it's following the trilogy aspect. It's following the whole, like, of course it's following the hero's journey. I mean, like, Hobbit, like the Hobbit is basically one of the greater examples of the hero's journey in
Absolutely.
a way. But that in itself, the whole film is just these sly winks to the audience. I'm winking to Matt right now to display it. It is a wink to the audience.
Yep. He is winking.
Basically telling you, oh, this happened earlier, wink. And it's like literally relying on the audience just to get all giddy by the whole, ooh, they're referencing Lord of the Rings, which will happen eventually. Instead of literally just telling the story, they're literally just relying so much on stuff that will happen instead of focusing on the stuff that's currently happening now
in the
story.
Playing as fluff.
Oh, it's fluff, totally fluff. And it's such a huge bummer because kind of like what you were talking about in DCU with casting is I think the casting in The Hobbit is great, but it's sort of, I would say The Hobbit is definitely one of the missed opportunities.
Certainly.
I enjoy it a lot as a fan, of course, but it's one of those situations where it's the same thing with the prequels, Star Wars in a way, is they're kind of the whole films, in my opinion, same thing with the Hobbit trilogy, is they're both relying on the events to come in the second series in the films. They're focusing so much on this is what will happen eventually, instead of focusing on really building what happened prior. It's a little frustrating. I think that's an example where them almost referencing or focusing on nostalgia is its weakest point. Where honestly, if I would watching like say the prequels to the Star Wars and it would be kind of being these like lots of references to the upcoming trilogy, and I had not seen the upcoming trilogy, would I really enjoy it as much? Would I get it as much? That's sort of the thing that's hard for me to really answer since I have not really seen the prequel films first. I've always seen the original trilogy first. Right.
So you're consuming it, in a non-linear order.
So it makes me question really what's the person who has not seen that media like reinterpret it. So it's making me kind of question.
I have an opinion on that.
Go ahead.
So I've totally talked to and heard from some younger folks, I mean, especially, being here in college and then, being in classes with a lot of people that are 10 years younger than me. So I know plenty of people that's what they grew up on in terms of like the prequels.
Mm-hmm.
That's their Star Wars. And that's actually looked back upon fairly fondly with people that are a few years younger than yourself and, a decade younger than myself. I don't get it, but
everything's subjective in nostalgia, I guess.
But and I think there's that nostalgia there. It's what they grew up with. I wanted to put in another little tidbit with I think was a really good example of poor use of nostalgia in a cash grab sort of fashion. And I won't dive super into it. I mean, it's been out for a while, but just in case anybody hasn't read this. This is a piece of literature. Harry Potter and the Cursed Child.
Ooh.
Have you read that?
I've not actually, because it's one of those things I will read just out of curiosity because I've heard so many mixed things. It's one of those things where my friend worded this to me when I said, "Hey, I just bought this. Should I read it?" And they're like, "I wouldn't." I'm like, "Why?" It's basically bad fan fiction that J.K. Rowling somehow approved, and
that she co-wrote.
Oh, she.
Yeah, it's rough. So I won't get into every reason why I think that's really bad. It goes back to that, like what we were talking about earlier, that sort of pandering to your audience by opening this just beloved world back up, but then it doesn't end up even being like okay, this is just recycled.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to create something new by revisionist sort of history.
Oh.
It basically, all the things that you fell in love with about the characters, especially from the original series, will be compromised. And so that, I think, was absolutely they were trying to capitalize on that nostalgia of, we're giving all the Potter fans what they want. Another, it's technically a screenplay, but another piece of literature to take in. But then there was obviously the effort to try to do something original. So I applaud that.
Yeah.
But it's one of those where I feel like J.K. Rowling specifically as the creator should have sat down and went, is this going to compromise my fans, thoughts on these characters that they literally grew up with? And is that right for me to put that out? I think as a creator, you have to ask yourself that question. And I honestly feel like they shouldn't have.
It's the same with, kind of J.K. Rowling, George Lucas, or even Peter Jackson in general when it comes to these big franchises that they started,
right.
Or at least adapted.
Michael Bay and millions of Transformers.
Yeah.
Stop what you're doing.
It's just that whole that feeling of we're giving the audience what they want. I'm like, well, what makes you think that? I mean, it's kind of like what you said. Yes, you're giving us this embodiment of a substance that we want, and that being whether it's a TV show, action figure, movie, you name it, and you're just giving it back to us, almost like this regurgitation of here's this. But you're not really putting much thought into it. That's definitely, I would definitely get that is a crutch. It's frustrating as a fan to be kind of presented with something that this is what you want. I'm like, did you ask me directly what I wanted? No, you just make presumptions.
True, but my counter argument to that would be, do we do this to ourselves?
Because we do.
As a culture, of course they're going to continue making terrible Fast and the Furious movies and terrible Transformers films because people will go and watch those films.
Oh, yes.
And especially really beloved franchise like we were talking about, Star Wars. When I hear about Lucasfilm and Disney planning 2 more trilogies after this current one.
They're milking it for everything it's worth.
And I have to say, as much of a fan as I am, it kind of turns my stomach. But then I'm not going to bullshit you, Jimmy. I can't say that I would sit here and go, I'm going to absolutely boycott those films. I would definitely go check them out.
We're all going to see Solo when it comes out.
Oh, geez, that's a whole nother.
I know, but we will see it when it comes out.
No, absolutely. Because honestly, I kind of, but sometimes it works though, because I had my doubts about Rogue One. I thought that film was fantastic.
Oh yeah.
Walking out of there, I was so pleasantly surprised. Mm-hmm. So I think sometimes that kind of stuff can work.
One's got to take chances, I would say, and it's kind of we learn from those chances. I mean, do we want to end this on a good note? We kind of talked about how oh man, all these franchises are bleak and.
Well, no, we got a couple more things to talk about. So we had to fling a little
dirt,
a
little dirt in our childhood. Yeah,
so,
people are ruining it.
Do you feel that? I'm pretty sure I already know the answer because we've kind of spoke to it.
Mm-hmm.
But do you feel that nostalgia fuels the current reboot, remix, sequel culture?
Oh, definitely. Because like no matter what decade you're in, like people are reinterpreting stuff from the past and reinterpreting what they grew up on. Because kind of to understand that present, you got to understand what happened in the past, because the past repeats itself. And in this case, people want to reinterpret ideas, thoughts, and whatnot using these tools they're familiar with. In this case, like older films, older literature, and they're kind of thinking, I want to evaluate how I feel about the present using stuff from the past. So definitely, I think right now in this period of what is going on, I'm frustrated with what's going on. So to kind of tell how we feel about now, we're kind of using what we know in that case is what we grew up on, and what we read, what we've seen.
Yeah, I'm not impervious to it either. I definitely don't want anybody listening here to think that I'm on the self-righteous train, because I absolutely consume nostalgic media. And I am also, like I was mentioning earlier, I do participate in a bit of escapism.
As do I.
And there are things I very much prefer being an adult to being a child, but I do think that a lot of the things, in terms of media, that were around when I was a child are way cooler. And I like, toys were cooler, I think. Cartoons were cooler. And I don't know, I'm sure that every generation thinks that.
Oh, yeah. It's also,
same thing with the music.
It's subjective, yeah.
But talking about, this remix, reboot culture, I would love to get your sense on original art. Where that leads original art. Is original ideas in art and entertainment, are those becoming extinct? Because you have to admit it's a lot fewer and far between in this, in that kind of remix, reboot, nostalgia, sequel culture.
In regards to new and old art, I mean, there's this quote I remember someone saying, and I'm probably paraphrasing it, but basically someone says, we repeat because no one understood what we were trying to say prior. So in its way, like, it's original, end quote, is just, it could be considered repeating, but it's just sort of bringing to new people's attention. Because honestly, we have all these new generations of people. So something they haven't seen before, they'll see as original. I think we repeat because we want people to kind of try to understand what's going on now and in the past, and basically trying to figure out, like, it's kind of like in the Bible, nothing's new under the sun. It's kind of, it's like, I never thought I would quote a Bible in a podcast, but like, me being a lapsed Catholic, but not a confirmed atheist, and pretty neutral in the matter. But that's another topic on its own. But like, it's just a hard topic, because what is original? That is a really hard question to ask, Matt.
Well, I mean, okay, just to kind of, throw in my 2 cents. I look at, just recently, there was the 1980s and 1990s long-running show Roseanne was just rebooted. And I mean, there's so much, to huge ratings. Television is largely dead, and there was huge ratings for that, to the point that our president even tweeted about it. And that's a whole nother podcast for another day. But, and it's all the original cast, and it's the same kind of idea. We already talked about a lot of the good examples in film, but I kind of wonder, being a moviegoer that tries to go to films that aren't necessarily just blockbusters. We're talking just films, and the same thing with television or books. I still enjoy that, like, discovery of, like, there's this thing that not everybody's freaking out about, not everybody's into.
Secret only you know.
Right. I still enjoy that, but in being that kind of person, I've noticed that these new and sort of original works are becoming less and less. And when you go to, let's just say movies, I remember when I saw Get Out, which I would say is an extremely original work. even though there was a lot of inspiration in it from past, works, that's a very original work. That was in the height of its popularity. People were freaking out about it, and there was maybe 15 people in the theater on an evening, on a weekend. Yeah. And at the time, there were some bigger blockbusters because this was kind of around the winter time and everything. And I was wondering, I'm like, I bet you if this was, I can't remember what else was out at the time, but bigger movies, I bet you there'd be more people in this theater. If this wasn't, it was, bigger than an independent, but I mean, maybe slightly. That's not a big, gigantic budget movie.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of wonder if those sorts of really original ideas that aren't necessarily as nostalgic as some of these other franchises we've been talking about, are those going to be viable moving forward?
It's hard because it's easier to market what you know and what people are familiar with. It's definitely a lot easier for studios to be like, well, we're going to focus on this because we know this is where the audience is. And with Get Out's example is even though it does have a lot of focus on the now, and it's definitely a lot of focus on films in the past. I mean, Jordan Peele definitely highly said, oh yeah, Rosemary's Baby and The Stepford Wives were a huge influence. The idea of the horror coming from the people in our culture and whatnot. And really the world we're creating around us. It's almost like our culture it's not that we're afraid to see something new. Actually, we definitely are afraid of seeing something new in the end, but
can I interrupt you? I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
I think that there's that comfort in what you know. And I think a lot of times people go, okay, I mean, it's expensive to to have cable. It's expensive to go to the movies. I think a lot of times people go, oh, I think that's why people rewatch the same shows.
Yeah, they don't want to work. They don't want to work.
Right. And I think we've all done it. We're all guilty of that. But I think that there's an interesting crippling level of comfort that Americans especially get into, and I think that definitely plays into nostalgia, and then that escapism, like we were talking about.
Yeah, it's sort of and kind of as a good example of nostalgia is, at least, and if we're talking about Get Out, it's that movie dealt with a lot of subject that people had to know about, people had to see, people had to know that this is
very
what's going on. It's quote unquote woke. Definitely is a word that people are using nowadays.
Extremely woke.
Yeah. But sort of the thing is it feeds you that little tidbit of what you know, to kind of what you said prior with Stranger Things, is to bring you a new realm, a new idea, something that you never thought of before, but you now are a lot more of a thoughtful being. You're thinking, okay, I never thought of this before.
Well, do you think you could say the same thing about...
It's a key basically to unlock something.
For nostalgia. Sure. Do you think you could say the same thing about The Shape of Water?
Ooh, Shape of Water. The first time I loved it. The second time I hated it, actually.
Really? Okay. I saw it once.
I saw it 4 times at this point, and each time I sort of was able to crack down every single little bit of reference it was making, to the point where there wasn't nothing really anything new in it. It was just literally just a sea of just Amélie, Jean-Pierre Juanet references, classic movies, and I eating it up the first time. I loved it so much. The more time I read it, I'm thinking, okay, it's got to the point where it became so familiar to me that I didn't like it because there's nothing new in it once I got past the weeds of familiarity and nostalgia and references.
Interesting.
I know, that's kind of the moment where I kind of found myself wanting to see something different. Oof.
Interesting. Well, I have only seen it the once, so I can only speak to that. But upon first watching it, I mean, like you said, there is it's in a lot of ways a love letter to cinema.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Without doubt.
And I'm not going to lie, when that's done well, Scorsese's done it, Spielberg's done it.
Oh, yeah, Hugo.
I eat it up. I love it. Being, a lover of cinema myself.
Mm-hmm.
But as it went on, and maybe my opinion would change, just here's when I watched it again. But as it went on, I found myself really taken by what I felt was a pretty original story in a culture where that's kind of becoming few and far between. But that's a great segue. I have one more question just kind of on this same specific topic. Obviously, as everyone knows now, that won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Guillermo del Toro won Best Director.
Oh, yeah.
So I've come to notice that the one thing about original films and original television and all that kind of stuff, they are receiving their just cause critically, it seems like. And typically these sorts of bits of media and franchises that are heavily laden with in the sequel reboot culture, or heavily laden with nostalgia, seem to almost be kind of the bastard children, even if they are good, of critics. Why do you think that is? Do you think that there's, that some people are maybe not willing to just go, you know what, I like this because it makes me feel good? Do you think it's that, or do you think so? It's like, oh, I'm gonna rebel against this because it's cool, or because people that maybe aren't necessarily as educated about this form of media, they're into it, so I don't want to be into it.
It's definitely like this overly obsessed like sequel reboot culture. It's just kind of the whole like rehashing of what's familiar with just copy-paste formula. It does get a little discouraging, a little annoying, a little pandering, kind of what we repeated earlier. But at the same time, it's just, we kind of accept that. We really want to play in that world now. Even if we don't like certain elements of it, we kind of want to we want to get a taste of like, I kind of want to be hanging out with Vin Diesel again in that movie. Even though I don't like anything else going on, I just want to hang out with that guy. It's just sort of like we all kind of pick and choose what we want in our media. We kind of, it's sort of like, I remember this one guy, I was like met him at the film festival recently, and he's like not a huge Shakespeare fan, but he would take tidbits of Shakespeare and put in his own film, even though he's just like, well, why? And he's like, well, I just kind of take what works for me, I take what I like, and I'll just go from there. And I think that's kind of why I think people keep redoing sequels. At least, that's why, let me reword that. It's why I keep seeing sequels in series, is because I go for just the tidbits that make me want to go back to it. I want to hang out with Vin Diesel again, or I want to see Rocket Raccoon in the third Guardians of the Galaxy movie or whatnot, or I want to see what happens in Part 2 of Infinity War, which you should all go check out if you really want to know what goes down. It's that curiosity. You may or may not like it, but it's that curiosity. I think that's what really fuels audiences to go back.
So we've talked about some finer examples of, reboots that are, or sequels that are heavily laden with nostalgia, or even original works. Now, on the opposite side of the coin, we talked about stuff that's more critically acclaimed because it's original. And do you think that there's some work that is in those sort of realms? It's in the middle of a gigantic series or a huge franchise that maybe isn't getting its just deserve, just because it's owned by Disney, or it's or it's part of a huge franchise, or it's a Netflix show or something like that. Specifically, I think about Logan.
Oh yes,
I think that film definitely broke out of the barriers of just the typical superhero film, and should have got a lot more recognition than it did. Or even even Deadpool. I don't think it should have been like a Best Picture, but that should have been nominated. That was a great film, I think, in a lot of ways. I think the same can be said for the last two Captain Americas were really strong films. So why do you think that is? Is that, like I was mentioning earlier, do you think that there's a little bit of a rebellion on the part of critics that they don't want to accept, things that are more universally loved or that aren't necessarily original. Because, I mean, even if there's original stories being told in these works, when it's adapted from a comic or adapted from a book, it's not 100% original.
Mm-hmm. I feel that like critics are so focused on is that feeling of, this type of media is lower than the other. There's kind of like, I feel like definitely critics are focused on the hierarchy. And kind of like touching base on Logan, we made that one a very strong superhero film. The fact that it was a superhero film, but that in itself, it dabbled with other traits that other genres dealt with. It kind of told the plot of a superhero using traits from Western films, from basically
road films.
Road films, yeah. Something, it basically reevaluates what we're known about the genre, the whole remix culture and whatnot. And I think critics... I don't know why. I'm very mixed about critics. I like a critic that isn't spending the whole time writing about how I don't like critics that focus so much on, well, this film is not like this film. They're trying to compare things that should not be comparable whatsoever. And they're trying to make it. I like critics that focus on what the film is and not try to compare it to anything else. Like, what is this? And instead of trying to be like, well, it's not Citizen Kane. It's not French at 2/3 at the 400 blows. It's
so The Godfather should be The Godfather. Spider-Man should be Spider-Man.
Oh yeah, I'm not going to say, well, the Spider-Man sucks because it's not Godfather. Or the Godfather is great because it's not Spider-Man. It's just sort of like, that makes no freaking sense.
Well, no, and I agree with you. I think that there's almost this kind of totem-like quality to where we, what kind of regard we hold critics, especially in media. And I think that's weird. I think that things can be good in their own right.
Yeah.
And I think a large problem, we talked about the Academy, is, there's been a lot that's been said about like cultural diversity with the Academy. I think there's not enough diversity in film with, I think the Golden Globes have a leg up on them in the fact that they have a musical comedy section, and then a dramatic section. And even then, it's limited.
Oh, yeah. We definitely need a demographic of people that are open to seeing other things and not just sticking with what's familiar with them. It's sort of like, there definitely is not a cultural diversity in the Academy whatsoever. They're getting better at it, but they're still...
Oh, it's so behind.
It's still so behind.
The fact that it's 2018. It's ridiculous.
But like the fact that like, for me, it's like, I definitely think in terms of representation of film genres, that's its own topic on its own. It's the fact that like, definitely we need people to be patient moviegoers, ones that are admitting that I am seeing something that I would normally not see. But I'm just going to sit through it. I'm going to see it. I'm going to be pleasantly surprised. And I think that's a sign of a mature critic, a mature moviegoer, and a mature Academy voter is one that is willing to sit through something. They know, I may not like this, but I'm going to give it a try. Open-mindedness, I think, is definitely a big key to play.
Yeah. So, before we wrap up, I got one more question for you. And this is kind of a conglomeration of some of the themes and stuff we've discussed today. Do you think, just overall, in general, not even necessarily just focusing on nostalgia and reboots and everything, but I think that it speaks maybe to nostalgia. Do you think that in terms of new content that's coming out, that we have an oversaturation in the digital marketplace? And if you do think that, I'd love to hear how you feel like that speaks to nostalgia.
An oversaturation in the digital marketplace.
Yeah.
So basically, not even just the internet, everything.
All across the board media. Man.
It's hard to say because it's almost like once it's oversaturated when there's no more room to be made, then in the end there's always going to be a new decade to rehash and revisit.
Sure, but you have to fish through a lot more content though.
I know. It's definitely oversaturated.
Do you think that maybe that's why there's that like return to, I'm going to go back to when there wasn't as many options. I'm going to go back to what I know rather than...
And I'm going to bring that back to the surface, even though in that its end, you're still adding to the saturation. It's interesting.
That's a great point, yeah.
It's definitely kind of like this endless circulation of absorption of media, whether it's new or old or rehashed, remixed. It's never ending. So in the end, there's always endless room, even though it's oversaturated. I mean, I'm kind of like this. I've never been asked this question before. It's really giddy. I'm really giddy about that. But like at the same time, it's like, ooh, I don't want to have awkward pauses.
Well, do you think that's like a good thing or a bad thing? Because I don't necessarily see it as either or.
It's definitely good because it's oversaturated because people are, one, identifying that it is. I mean, the first sign of solving a problem is identifying it, and makes them feel like, okay, what's going on right now? How can we really go about it in the next direction? It's kind of never ending.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's definitely my opinion to oversaturation. It's never ending in our media world.
Okay, so just closing out, I would love for you to leave the folks that are going to listen to this just a few recommendations of some works. It could be literary, it could be film, television, doesn't matter, that you feel like really properly encapsulates nostalgia or invokes some nostalgia in you.
Ooh, definitely. Well, definitely, of course, The Usual Suspects that we talked about. Definitely see those. I mean, those are pretty big people, though. Those are big matters one can easily find. But the ones that I definitely feel like should be definitely brought into consideration is, of course, the current directors we see right now, like Wes Anderson. Some of his biggest influences, especially, would be Francois Truffaut. And I definitely recommend looking into his filmography, as well as the works of definitely Jean-Pierre Jeunet. I like French directors, typical millennial, you know? And then definitely, he's from the 40s, and even though, of course, I'm not part of that generation, obviously, it's definitely a period that I've always been curious about, is the 40s. So Ernst Lubitsch, he did a lot of films like To Be or Not to Be, Trouble in Paradise, and all those three directors are ones that at least people see Wes Anderson, the director, but in my mind, he heavily cites those things. And I definitely recommend those directors' filmography. And you kind of find out what works for you in that realm. Yeah, definitely. It's like definitely the Antoine Doinel series is definitely a good one. It's a series of 7 films done by Francois Truffaut, where it basically does what Boyhood did, but in the 7 films where it really uses the same actor slowly growing up from childhood, adolescence to adulthood, and him being a parent. Oh, wow. It's an interesting chronicle of like a rise and fall of one person and how it parallels the actor himself and the director himself and what they're going through. It may be a little bit of a little snooty recommendation, a French film series, but that's definitely something that's always kind of piqued my interest.
Like we led into, you're a connoisseur.
I can like lowbrow culture too.
No, I think those are great recommendations. I want to thank you again for being on here, man. I'm so stoked that you could be the very first guest on Nerds with Opinions, and thanks for doing it, man. Oh yeah, happy to be here. Would love to let me back and talk more nerd stuff with you. Yeah, let's definitely do it. Thanks, man. Of course. Salute. So that was an awesome conversation with my good buddy Jimmy Leavens. The dude is just a total wealth of knowledge and just the nicest guy to boot. We talked about a little bit of everything in regards to nostalgia. This was a longer episode than I might do in the future, but when he and I get together, we really get carried away with conversations. We're kind of the same speed. We can go on and on about movies and television. And he's just the nicest guy. And I want to thank him for being my first guest. And I want to thank you for listening to the podcast. Keep listening. If you enjoyed it, let me know. And if you're listening to this, there's going to be more of these. This was really, really fun. I want to put out as many of these as possible. So thanks again for checking it out. My name's Matt Holben, and you've been listening to Nerds with Opinions.